Hello, my name is Taylor Weibel, and I chose Steve Jobs as my business person presentation. I chose Steve Jobs just because he is a very well-known business person. He is really the face of Apple products, which is a huge corporation. I mean, if you go through, I'm sitting in RSU classroom, and a lot of the computers I see are Apple. Honestly, that's what gave me the inspiration to have Steve be my business person that I chose to talk about today. He's earned the name entrepreneur, inventor, industrial designer. He really has taken off. And after doing research on him, finding the ethical decisions he made have really surprised me in a lot of different ways. It doesn't surprise me that he did end up at the top. He definitely earned the spot that he did, coming from not a whole lot and really just building an empire. That was very interesting reading and learning about Steve and the decisions that he made to get to where he is or was at the time of his death. To tell you a little bit about Steve before we get into all the ethical stuff, he was born and raised in San Francisco. That's one of the places in the United States that has a ton of different influences. They've got a ton of different people, a lot of different opinions floating around. Everybody can really be expressive in that area. And that was one of the things that really influenced Steve Jobs as he grew as a person. He was adopted at birth by Paul and Clara. They raised him in San Francisco. He went to high school there. He attended Reed College, and in 1972 he actually decided to drop out, which a lot of people would really kind of look down upon. A lot of people will get into college and they, if it doesn't carry it all the way through, they are looked down upon or considered a failure or whatever that may be. It's not a completion of the goal that they set out to do. People tend, especially getting to the point where Steve did, serving others and really impressing others really can be overtaking and get to the point where it just overshadows everything and you end up in a place that you don't want to be. Steve actually decided to drop out to go over to India to study Buddhism, and while he was over there he was so influenced that it actually had a lot to do with the way the Apple products are designed and created today. So interesting enough, he really, because of that, he decided to drop out of college, which is something that most people would have looked down upon and judged as improper, ended up being one of the better decisions he did, which was able to influence him in his future products. Along the way, he had a couple relationships here and there. Chris Ann Brennan was one of the big ones. He was with her from high school all the way up until the start of Apple, on and off. Ethically speaking, their relationship would be frowned upon. They were nowhere near faithful to each other. They were on and off. Steve Jobs really struggled a lot in his life finding where he was as a person, and really had a hard time staying faithful to her, as well as that later led her to be unfaithful to him. They knew they loved each other. They really did. They didn't want to separate, but they also knew they couldn't commit to each other. This made me really look back on one of one of the weeks we did our GBPAs at the self-serving bias. Support pre-existing views. Judgments are shaded by their own self-interest. So even though they knew that they were interested in each other and wanted to be together, they decided that by their own, Steve Jobs' self-interest of finding Apple and doing that business endeavor was more important than being faithful and committed to Chris Ann Brennan. After dropping out of Reed, Jobs was in a period of his life where he was so low on such a low part of his life that he was sleeping on friends' dorm room floors, returned Coke bottles for food, that way he could have money to eat, ate at any local shelter that would give him free meals. And honestly, it showed that Brennan stopped associating herself with him, but not completely, but to the point where she was not claiming him as her significant other. 1977 rolled around and Brennan found out she was pregnant with Jobs' child. And at the time, Jobs had recently started Apple and really became well known within that company. And at that point, she was so afraid, and they weren't established, so she considered giving the child up for adoption. And at that point, Jobs decided to no longer talk with her or help her whenever she decided to put the child up for adoption, because he did not believe that that was ethically right. But she had to do what she had to do to survive, and she was in no place to take care of a child, and neither was he. He began spreading horrible rumors about her, that, she had slept around, and that at that point he may not have even been the father. But when it came time to do a paternity test, Jobs denied taking the test, and then later court mandated to pay $500 a month to support their child. So his plan to not support the child, which was surprising, and that he made that ethical decision to not be there as a father, but then later decided to be, but not during the pregnancy. That kind of was the beginning of Apple. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak co-founded Apple in 1976. And it all started to sell Wozniak's Apple I personal computer that he had made. And then after about a year, that's whenever the fame and wealth became coming into the picture, and everything was mass produced. The way they did that, they really got in touch with the right people and took off, and were doing whatever it could have been to create success for their company. The unsuccessful Apple Lisa, the Apple Lisa actually was the name of his daughter that was born with Kristen Benson. Apple Lisa is the name of his daughter, and that's how they got the name. And then after that, which it was unsuccessful, the Macintosh came out, which is still to this day one of the most popular computers. It was one of the groundbreaking computers that really just changed the face of laptops altogether. John Sculley hired Steve Jobs, and he was the CEO of Apple at the time, and he really had a hard time and created missteps in the company and created a lot of downfall. Steve Jobs later was talking about how he hired the wrong guy, and he handled that with grace, and he handled that with accepting his mistake and not continuing to make that be the downfall of Apple. He took what Sculley had done, and even though he cost him billions of dollars, he came back as CEO and allowed the backdating of stock options, even though that's one thing that Sculley had a hard time and really screwed the company up on. In terms of decision processes and style, Jobs was famous. He was a tough micromanager. It was important that Jobs did not grow down the slippery slope, was another one that really stuck out to me on the GBPAs. It was good that he didn't let his decisions be clouded due to Sculley's mistakes, and continued to grow as a company even though he hired the wrong guy. And that Sculley guy created a horrible, horrible name and horrible consequences for his company. Whenever I was looking and doing some research, one of the quotes I found about Steve Jobs was that Mr. Jobs' own research and intuition, not focus groups, were his guide. When asked what market research went into the iPad, Mr. Jobs replied, "None. It's not the consumer's job to know what they want." This is very true, and it's important that people, whenever they're buying a product, it's important for the producers to convince the consumers that that is something that they will want and will be great, make their product sound better than everybody else's. And Steve Jobs did this in a way that wasn't fake, wasn't unethical. He did it in a very way that was true. He told exactly how the Mac would be, and every other product that had Apple was producing. It's important to know that what people want, what's out there, what's new, what's best, and it's important for companies to not take advantage of that. And Steve Jobs didn't necessarily take advantage. He just created a product that people would need and would want. And it's just important that people are bounded ethically. And Jobs took it upon himself to make his products be the #1 hot thing out there that people wanted, or at least they thought that they did. and it took off, and that worked for him very well in a way that it didn't harm or hurt other people in the process. In 1973, Steve Wozniak designed his own version of the classic video game Pong. After finishing it, Wozniak gave the board to Jobs, who took it down to Atari, and Atari thought that Jobs had created it and actually gave him a job because of that game, and Jobs accepted it. However, that was one of the things that was unethical in that instance. He definitely should have given Wozniak his recognition for the game. By accepting this position, it really was to the point where Jobs, like I said, was unethical. He could have been demonstrating obedience to authority by wanting to please Atari and get himself out there. He was in a financial hole from dropping out of college and going over to India and hitchhiking and all that, like I mentioned in the past. So it's important that he gave Wozniak the recognition he deserved, even though he did not. In 1976, Apple announced that it would buy Next, which is one of the products that Steve Jobs had been working on, for $427 million, and the deal was finalized in February, which brought Jobs back into Apple, and he got it taken off from there. Apple, through this time, Jobs was vocal about his opinions of other companies. He even criticized Dell for their uninnovative beige boxes that they supplied to their computers in. Ethically, he should have just kept his mouth shut. It doesn't matter what other companies are presenting or how they present it. Jobs took it upon himself to go out of his way to talk about that. In 2003, Jobs was diagnosed with cancer. He had pancreatic cancer, and he lived with it from 2003 to 2011, and he had been granted a medical leave in January, and then in August he announced his recognition as CEO and named Tim Cook as his successor as CEO. Jobs died at Ken, California on October 5th, 2011 due to his pancreatic cancer, and left the Apple to Tim Cook. Tim Cook actually stood up and took Apple and created it and continued on with it and made it just as successful as Steve Jobs had. Steve Jobs did make some decisions that were unethical. However, whenever you come from what he came from and came out as well as he did something right. Even though he may not have done it the most ethical way, he did do it in a way that made a successful product and is still a successful product today. I appreciate your time. Thank you guys. I hope we answered your questions about Steve, and you guys have a great day.